I just finished reading Leviticus, and boy, were the rules in there.
Oh, my goodness. Can you imagine trying to live with that?
Well, some of them, were so reasonable,
Right.
when you harm somebody or whatever, you pay them back full plus a fifth, and some of that was okay, but my goodness, the whole book was on the rules
Yeah.
and the law. Of course, they called it the law at that time.
Yeah, I have a friend who is he's a Reformed Jew, and so they have a different interpretation of some of the ordinances of the law and what have you. But I had an interesting conversation with him one time about what happens after this world, and he believes that nothing happens after this world. That that you live here and then that is it. And that's so far outside of my.
Doesn't believe in heaven or.
Nope.
No.
Wow.
Some of the Jewish sects.
A friend of mine is a Reformed Jew, and he doesn't believe in the idea of heaven.
Oh.
He lives here on earth, and then that's it. And I said, so what is the goal? And he said, well, the goal is right now. He said, that's why I don't eat bacon, I don't do these other things, because that's the way I live out my commitment to God right now, because this is the chance I get to live in covenant with God. And so, but it's a completely different, like for him, those places, now he's a Reformed Jew, so everything in Leviticus is not on the table, but for him, those, the ordinances given that they believe are binding today, he doesn't see them as binding. He sees them as, this is the blueprint for me being faithful today. It's how I show the world that I'm in relationship with God. And so it's not you do this and you get the payoff. It's you do this so that other people see you. You look different. You act differently. Which was just a completely different. It's a completely different viewpoint for me. Because I don't, he called it payoff, and I was like, well, I think you're being a little too harsh there. But not believing in an
Is there
afterlife.
a group of him? I mean, what do they call themselves?
Jews.
Reformed Jews.
Just Reformed Jews?
Yeah. They consider themselves Jews.
I
They're
I had no idea Reformed Jews didn't believe in a heaven, an afterlife with God.
some of them do. Some of them do.
Oh, okay.
Judaism is much less, I've discovered, much less formal in terms of, they're not really denominations in the way that ours are.
Right.
And so, when you get to, Orthodox and conservative Jews, it's pretty homogeneous. But as you get further along the spectrum, Reconstructionists and Reformed Jews are more of, I'm going to call them like a centered set, where there is kind of a majority of them hold similar beliefs,
Right.
but then some of them hold other beliefs that aren't necessarily, not necessarily in that set, but they're still. Amy Jill Levine is one of my favorite Bible scholars. She's Jewish, but she is one of my favorite New Testament scholars. Actually, she studies New Testament. And one time
And she's Jewish?
and she's Jewish. And one time she went to Harvard, and I attended a lecture, and she said, Christians get together and argue about the scriptures and split off into other denominations and different groups. She said, us Jews, we get into heated arguments about the scriptures, and then when we're done, we all have dinner together. And so it's a very different give and take. And so my friend, Ben is actually, that falls outside of what many of his fellow Reformed Jews believe. But he's not the only one that thinks that way. So it's different. I will say that. It's a whole different way of, and I struggle to get my head around it.
Right.
To me, the idea of eternal life, the resurrection of the dead, that is extremely important to me. That's like a core idea of faith, life with God now and forever.
Right.
But for him, it's life with God now because this is
it.
this is the chance I get, and so it's interesting.
I kind of got you off track here.
No, it's all good. So this is our 5th and last session. Starting next Sunday, we're going to move into some other worship series. We're preparing for the Jubilee year here at the church, the 40th anniversary of the building, and so I appreciate you being here for our sessions on the Book of Esther. So this final session, I've entitled it "Hope for the Hopeless." Maybe our conversation might take us in different places, but that's where I figured we would start. The picture that is at the bottom is a mosaic from, I believe, the 9th century of Esther looking pensive before going to the king. And so that is often how chapters 4 and 5 have been depicted. That we imagine a space between 4 and 5 during that fast where there is a lot of uncertainty as to what's going to happen. Because the story moves right from 4 to 5, the payoff for us happens almost right away. But there is that space where she is not sure what's going to happen. She's not sure what's going to happen to the Jewish people, perhaps, although in my message I have my own thoughts. They don't have to be your thoughts. But I figured we would talk about hope, even in that space of perhaps being pensive. So on the second page, just some things for you to think about in the future. You don't have to tell me. The Apostle Paul writes, "Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what is seen?" And so hope is something that is, you don't hope for something you already have in the present. You hope for a future outcome. You hope for a future result. And so I invite you to, when we're done here, to think about, what are things you hope for, and dig a little deeper perhaps. What do you mean when you say you hope for something? What kind of hope are we talking about? And I have a word cloud here at the bottom with, I typed hope into a thesaurus, and I took the words that came up. I did my best to put them in a word cloud so none of them stick out too much, hopefully. But I thought we might take a minute and maybe you can share what, if any, of these words you would associate with the word hope.
Desire.
Desire? All right.
Depending on what you hope for, optimism.
Optimism, okay.
Confidence that it will happen.
Confidence,
Mm-hmm.
dream,
Believe.
Okay. Are there any of these that you wouldn't associate with hope?
Ambition.
Ambition? Okay.
I don't know if we'll ever rely on our hope, because it has the word reliance.
Mm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I just never associated being reliant on what I hoped for to.
Ah.
But sometimes that's what pulls you through, is the reliance on that hope to get you there. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of an interesting word.
Yeah,
I think
that's,
expectation follows right along with reliance.
yeah, that's kind of a, I guess maybe that depends on the measure of your hope.
And does your hope cause you to be prepared, or do you prepare out of your hope? That's an interesting way
Yeah.
word to put in there.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, I invite you to keep those words either floating around in your head this morning or for future meditation. I'm going to read Esther chapters 7 to 8:17a. I explained a few sessions ago why I stopped at 8:17a instead of going all the way to 10:3, which is the ending that we have in Scripture. Some scholars believe that from 8:17b to 10:3 is a later work or an appendix added by another author to justify the book's inclusion in the Bible on the basis of the holiday of Purim. Esther is a book that is read every year. The Jews read it during the Purim celebration. And so chapters 9 and 10 explain that background. But in its explanation, the author, editor, whoever added that appendix, adds items about the characters that violate the development of the characters so far. Or not necessarily violate, but change the actors in a way that affects their characters and makes them somewhat unlike what we've seen so far. And that's not, when we read Scripture, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We can read and be aware of those things. But I think for the sake of reading this as a story together, 8:17 is a stopping place, a resting place that concludes that part of the narrative. I'm not saying that the rest of it is not biblical or not scriptural. There's just a difference between the original story and the story as we have it. So you don't have to agree with me about that. You can go home and say, he's full of it. I'm going to read chapters 9 and 10 anyway, which is fine. I won't, we can still be friends. But 9:17 ends the story on an appropriately high note and seems to wrap up the main portion of the story. So I will read chapters 7 and 8 here. So the king and Haman came to drink with Queen Esther. On the second day, during the wine course, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It will be granted to you. And what is your request? I would grant you even half of my kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and should it so please the king, as my wish may I be granted my life, and as a request, my people. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, massacred, annihilated. If we had only been sold to be slaves, I would have kept silent. I speak because our adversary is not concerned with the king's loss." Then King Xerxes demanded of Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he who had the audacity to do such a thing?" Esther replied, "A man hateful and hostile, this wicked Haman." And Haman cringed in terror before the king and the queen. The king arose in his fury from the wine course and went out to the pavilion garden. Haman stood to beg Queen Esther for his life, for he saw that consequences were close at hand from the king. When the king returned from the pavilion garden to the hall, Haman had fallen across the couch on which Esther was reclining. And the king cried, "Do you also intend to have your way with the queen right here in my palace?" As soon as the words left the king's mouth, Haman covered his face with humiliation. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "What's more, a stake is standing at Haman's house, 75 feet high, which he made for Mordecai, whose words saved the king." The king ordered, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the stake he had made for Mordecai, and the king's fury subsided. That day King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the persecutor of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Mordecai was presented to the king, for Esther revealed how he was related to her. The king removed his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's property. Then once again Esther spoke to the king, falling at his feet and weeping, begging him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. "If it please the king, and if I have found favor with him, and if the idea seems proper to the king, and if I am pleasing to him, let letters be written overturning the plan of Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, to annihilate the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the disaster which will befall my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "See, I have given Haman's property to Esther, and he has been impaled on the stake for scheming against the Jews. Now, as for you two, write in the king's name as you please concerning the Jews, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a document written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be revoked." The royal scribes were summoned at that time, on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, and a decree was issued in accordance with all that Mordecai had commanded the Jews and the satraps and the governors and the officials of the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language. He had them written in King Xerxes' name and sealed with his signet ring. Written instructions were sent by couriers, riders on horseback, and riders of speedy camels to this effect: "The king has permitted the Jews in each and every city to gather and to make a stand for their lives, to destroy, massacre, and exterminate the forces of every people and province who afflict them, together with children and women, and to plunder their possessions on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar." A copy of the document was to be issued as a law in every single province and publicly displayed to all the peoples, so that the Jews should be ready for that day to vindicate themselves against their enemies. The couriers, riders on horseback, and riders of speedy camels went out urgently at the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then Mordecai went out from the king's presence in royal clothing of violet and white, in a large golden turban, and a cloak of linen and purple. And the city of Susa rejoiced and was merry. And the Jews had light and happiness, joy and glory. And in every single province and in every single city, wherever the king's command and decree arrived, there was happiness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday.
The end.
The end.
Yeah, I can see why, once you brought it up, there is a definite difference for the rest of the,
Mhm.
yeah.
Which makes sense if you want
Chapter 8,
to
9, and 10.
explain how Purim came to be. You need to do a little bit more work to
Right.
explain it.
Right.
It reads a little bit differently. So, is there anything that attracts you in this part of the story? Anything that seems kind of strange or off? Anything that grabs you in this part?
Now the Jews have got to go out and eliminate the people, too.
It's interesting there when one thing that jumped out to me as I was reading it and thinking about it was how the decree that Mordecai and Esther write includes women and children, which seems harsh to me. But it's pretty much verbatim what Haman's
Right.
edict was. And so that's in there because Haman included it in there. And so the idea is, if anybody tries to attack the Jews can attack them. And the same parameters are in play. And but it's interesting the way that, the previous verdict, because it can't be erased, how do you resolve that situation? And in this case, the way that they do it is by, the implication was that in the first one, they weren't allowed to defend themselves, and now they can at least, defend themselves.
Was
Yeah,
it
and
this-
it is the exact same decree on the exact same day.
It is the same
Mhm.
day?
Yeah.
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 And so this is something, if you go further to chapter 9, you see, as it's written, the Jewish people go further than or they take the edict literally and go out in a way that takes, I think the phrase that they use is vengeance, but there's no description of other people trying to attack them. And that's one of the places where the story is changed by those later chapters.
So they're trying to annihilate that group of people.
They're enemies, yes.
But isn't it only if you're attacked you can defend yourself? That's how I'm reading it is, it may or may not
Mhm.
happen,
Hmm.
but if it does, you can defend yourself or do more and not face consequences.
I think in chapter 9 the implication is that either they've been attacked and they continue to go, or because one of the places in chapter 9, Esther boldly asks the king for another day for the Jewish people to continue to annihilate their enemies, and the king says yes. And that's one of the places where Esther's character is. That's very un-Esther from the first few, Esther has learned over the course of this story that the way that she gets what she wants from the king is to stroke his ego. If, if it please the king, if the king finds favor with me, so on and so forth. And so it's a very Esther thing to do, to bring this along by saying it that way. If we get to chapter 9, Esther speaks as if she is fully the king's, as if she can almost boss the king around.
Become a hammer.
Yeah, which I mean, in theory, she probably could do, but that's not the way that she's gone. That's not the way that she's been doing it. She's learned, unlike Vashti, who simply did what she wanted, Esther has learned that she can manipulate the king as long as she shows appropriate
Respect.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, this is an interesting reversal, a good way of overcoming an irrevocable law.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that in verse, chapter 7, verse 3 and 4, where she's saying, if she pleases, blah, 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 spare my people, it would have been one thing if we had just merely been sold as, slaves, but to be annihilated, that's another deal.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even the way she phrases it,
Right.
in the translation I have here, that's not to say it's the only translation,
Right.
but she says, I speak because our adversary is not concerned with the king's loss.
Loss, right.
So she knows how to speak the king's language. It's almost like she has to cast it as, well, this guy is, it's not even for us necessarily. He's doing you badly. And so trying to continue to get to his ego, somebody who throws massive drinking parties and shows off all his wealth. And Esther says, yeah, you have this thing, and he's trying to take it away from you. That's, getting the king's attention. And perhaps there's something about, even trying to take Esther away from him, somebody who he has found to be more favorable to him than Vashti. So there might be, that might be in play. There's also some interesting other pieces. King Xerxes says, who is he? Where is he who had the audacity to do such a thing? The king being unaware that Haman had written it in the king's name. And so technically the king did it. He just doesn't know. There is a Jewish midrash on this, that when Haman says, that when Esther says, a man hateful and hostile, at first she points to the king, and an angel comes down and pushes her arm so that she's pointing to Haman instead. But yeah.
Yeah, what's interesting is right after that, it says the king arose in his fury and went out to the pavilion garden. So you're wondering, the bad guy's been revealed, but then why does the king leave and leave the Esther with the bad guy?
Yeah.
Because unless, the eunuchs were all there to protect her, maybe that was the deal, but, if he was a really bad guy, he would have maybe tried to kill the queen.
Yeah.
Right? Or have tried to escape.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is, and this also kind of plays into the king's character, that he's kind of a doof who has no idea what to do.
Right.
He's angry, but in the moment, his only response is he has to leave. And that is, he could have, you're right, he could have killed Esther and said, oh, she was lying.
Right.
That wasn't,
Right.
that's he could have even turned it around and said, well, this is a plot by the Jews. This is a plot by this people.
Or
But-
this is just a woman, this is just your queen.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
And then
Who are you going to believe?
And then it's the eunuch Harbona that says, hey, why don't you, because the king hasn't decided what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's the eunuch that says,
Let me give you an idea.
let me give you an idea.
Yeah, but then, to the king's credit, this is the one decision that he makes
Right.
in this part of the story. He does manage to make the decision to kill the man who's done everything evil in this story.
Right.
So I guess that is something. But then, why does the king have Haman impaled? There are multiple possibilities.
He's a warning to other people who will back up his aim.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there is what Esther said there about, my people are going to be destroyed, massacred, annihilated. Is there anything else? Like, there is a minority, again, with the Jewish, the Jewish people have arguments and then they all decide to hang together. There is a minority of rabbis who said the king decides to kill Haman because he sees Haman falling across the couch and thinks that Haman's going to violate Esther, which would be the final, that's taking the king's place.
Right.
And so there is that idea that, does that, the king is angry and goes and storms out. And is this the thing that finally does it for him? That it's, it's the final indignity, it's the final injustice. And so, it's played for laughs, but it's also, it's another thing for this king. It's finally, this has finally become personal. It's Queen Esther who has been condemned to die as part of this edict. And now it's Queen Esther who is being attacked right now in this very moment. But even then, like you said, Pete, it's one of the eunuchs who says, look, there's this. The king still doesn't, he still needs a little bit of nudging when, whether true or not, whether, Haman isn't trying to violate the queen. But from the king's perspective, it certainly looks like it. But he still needs that eunuch to say, hey, there's that stake we can all see because it's 7 stories tall. Why don't you do something with the stake? So there is another,
It's almost like he's connected the dots of, oh, I just read about these people trying to take me out, and Mordecai saving me. And then I've got Haman, who comes up with this grand idea that he thinks he's been, it's almost like he started connecting these dots.
Yeah.
Maybe this Haman isn't such a good guy after all.
Mm.
And he's putting these puzzle pieces together of, he's out to get me too.
Yeah.
And not only that, he's out to get my queen.
Mm-hmm.
And so, kind of wonder if he's finally connected all of those dots to say, do away with him. You're right, his final thought that was his own, he just didn't have a plan of how to get rid of it.
That's a great point, because Mordecai doesn't get noticed until he foils a plot to kill the king. And so here is perhaps another here's perhaps another plot, and this time it's happening right in front of his eyes. Yeah, that's a very good point.
I think you give the king a little bit too much.
No?
I'm not that favorable towards him. I think he has to have people plant ideas in his head. They're all planting ideas.
Well,
whether
Esther
it's-
is planting that.
I know she's
idea.
the one that's planning it, and then the eunuch is planning it, Haman planted it before, so for him to put dots together seems
took out-
far-fetched for me.
Right. I just saying it took help, but he finally got there. A lot of help,
Yeah, he was led.
yes.
And that's okay. We can we can read this like 3rd century Jews and come to different conclusions and still enjoy the story. All right, I'm gonna circle back to hope just a little bit. I'll say some of this in my message later. If you were at the 8 o'clock service, you've already heard it. But like I said, you don't ever need to agree with me when I get up there. I hope that God speaks to you, but not necessarily in agreement with what I am saying. Maybe a piece here and there. Maybe God is speaking to you in your not agreeing with something I say. I've gotten a lot out of sermons that I have not agreed with at all. So I'm putting one perspective out there. But I figure we can talk just a little bit more about hope. So, in the Hebrew Bible, the first set of books in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes we call it the primary history, because the story of Abraham all the way to the destruction of the first temple in 2 Kings follows one basic extended storyline. Once we get to Abraham, it snaps into history. And so you can follow that history all the way through until you get to 2 Kings. There's only one time where the Hebrew word for hope is used. And it's actually used in a negative sense. When one of the kings of Israel, late in 2 Kings, says, basically, the Lord has deserted me. How can I hope in the Lord? And that is considered one of the final nails in the coffin for the people of Israel, that there's a negative connotation of being able to trust God. But doesn't that extended story, doesn't that contain hope? It doesn't say it explicitly, but there are stories there where, the way I read it, the people don't survive without hope. There is something there. And so I was wondering if you could help me tease out some of the high points of hope for the people of Israel there. And I'm actually I'm also asking you to kind of help me out with a message that's going to happen in a few weeks.
But don't you think the beginning of Joshua, where they're getting ready to go into the promised land, it's that whole beginning of don't fear. You don't have anything to be afraid of. I mean, how many times does he say that over and over again in the first chapter? To me, that speaks of hope. We got this. God said he's going to give this to us. He said we don't need to fear. That, to me, is a real clear message of
Just God
the
bringing.
destination of where we're headed.
Yeah. Just,
And we know we're going there.
just God bringing the Jews out of Egypt. There was the hope that they are going to go to a promised land, that he's going to take care of them.
Miriam dances because she's hopeful of the future because what she's seen in the past.
Yeah, hope as kind of, if not the opposite of fear, or acceptance of a present lot as kind of a counterpoint to it. That there is, if the people of Israel don't hope, if the people preparing to enter the promised land don't hope, then does it happen? Which is not to say that God can't make things happen God's self. But early on in the scriptures, there is definitely, this is a God who interplays with people. This is a God who relies on the back and forth between people and God. I mean, we still have that God, but we tend to focus on, as Lutherans, what God does. And the scriptures, especially the early scriptures, God is always in conversation with the people. And so that does leave it, God's not going to pick the people up on the other side of the river and just dump them into the promised land. The people need to take that step. The people in slavery in Egypt need to be led out of Egypt. They need to accept that that they are entering a world of possibility, that they can finally hope for something better. So you're absolutely right. Hope as, I'm not going to say the opposite, because you can still be afraid of something and hope for it, but as kind of a counterbalance, as like a counterweight.
If you look at the words of expectation, anticipation, and your word bank, that all speaks to looking for the promised land, looking to the promised land, looking for God's love, or God's cloud and pillar of fire, that's the visible presence to guide them. Those are all places in that Old Testament there, those first few books.
So maybe, correct me if I'm not going where you're going. Almost the word hope doesn't need to be expressed if the word will is, will be, will happen. That is meant to be something that inspires hope. And so the response of the people isn't simply to hope in the sense of an interior feeling, but the hope is shown in the active response. Yeah, I like that.
Whenever you're searching for something better, there's hope. If things aren't going well, and you know that in time, things will probably be better. That's hope.
Yeah, we hope for something, we hope for something beyond our current situation.
Yes.
Yeah. I like that too.
Well, all throughout the beginning, even Noah and the ark, he hoped that God would save them. There was hope that he had to have had hope. It wasn't explicitly said, but all the stories were
I
built around hope.
And I realize this isn't technically scripture, but one of my favorite movies is Evan Almighty.
Yes.
If you haven't seen Evan Almighty, I recommend it, because it speaks to that story. Steve Carell becomes a Noah figure, being told to build an ark, so on and so forth, and you see what is implied in old Bill Cosby comedy sketches about Noah, where people are mocking Noah for building a big boat in the middle of a massive plain where there's no water around. And so you have to have hope that there's going to be a payoff there somewhere, or else you're just a silly looking guy building a boat. And so there is some of that, there does have to be some of that hope. And in a similar way, I suppose Abraham leaving his country, even at the very beginning of this whole history, there has to be hope in there.
Or Joseph in Egypt. He meant it for harm, but God meant it for good.
Yeah.
In all those situations that he found himself, he still righted on his feet. And he's the only Jew down there probably responding as he had learned in his faith walk and hope that I'm not going to stay. Someday I may get out of this prison.
Yeah.
He didn't stand idly by. Don't forget me when you get back into the palace. So he was still proactive. He wasn't stagnant. He was still proactive in his anticipation of his hope for what was to come. But I don't think he ever lost hope in maybe seeing his dad again.
Yeah.
He probably didn't know if it would really happen, but I think still it was his desire to see his family again.
So maybe hope as a close relative of trust.
I think it's a close relative of belief and believe.
Both.
Part of why maybe Paul puts them together in 1 Corinthians 13 when he talks about faith and hope and love. They interweave together. All right, so by the time that we get to what we sometimes call wisdom literature and the prophets, there are many more explicit references to hope. And perhaps, as we just talked about, hope being part of an action, or more of an active, an active verb, perhaps. By the time we get to wisdom literature and by the time we get to the prophets, hope is it's an interior attitude, and sometimes it can spark some sort of action. Sometimes it is simply a reminder to people that God has not forgotten you. And so you can hope, you can trust, believe that there will be a better future. Actually, one of the Old Testament wisdom and prophetic books that contains the word hope the most relative to the length of the book is Lamentations, which is very interesting that there is alongside the mourning, there are references to hope. There is some acknowledgement that God is somehow present and somehow working in what's going on. That goes along with Jeremiah, who goes into exile. And when you are in exile, it is perhaps easier to feel powerless because you are not only in exile. It's not like slavery in Egypt, where you were kept in perhaps an Israelite quarter in a slave area, but in exile you are scattered. And so there may be more of a need for people to be reminded that this is not God's ultimate plan for them. Perhaps. I'm just speculating. Let's see. Anything about that? Any ideas? Any ideas that come forth from that? Anything that you? I'll be honest. I am not a Jeremiah or Psalms or Job scholar, if there's anything in there that is interesting to you that you'd like to bring up, we can certainly talk about it.
I think my favorite part about Job is when God finally says, "Did you do all these things? Come on, buddy. Why are you're forgetting what you have, why are you questioning my authority when I am a God who follows through on what I say I'm going to do?" And I think in some ways, God was calling him to go back to his hope and his yes, you are right to rely on your faith, and it's okay for you to be sad and questioning, but, here's who I am. And
Comes back to
you can rely on that.
Comes back to the word trust
Mhm.
and believe.
And I love that part in Job, because I think it's a really good reminder to us when we get into our pity parties that, of course, probably none of you ever have pity parties. But
Oh, of course, nobody has pity parties.
it's
so.
easy to get there, and
Mhm.
it's a good place to go in the Bible to be reminded,
Yeah.
which brings hope.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of the Psalms too that are reminders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I never used to think of Job as a particularly hopeful book, but it really is.
Yeah, it is.
It really is. It's
In
not
the
meant.
end, he's restored
Mm-hmm.
to over and above what he was before.
Yeah, yeah. It's a meditation on suffering, but it's also a meditation on hope. It has to be. That's a very good point. All right. And then I wrote hope between the testaments. If you're are you familiar with the Apocrypha at all? The Apocrypha is a set of books that the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church include them in the Old Testament. Protestant churches generally do not. The Episcopal Church sometimes reads them in worship, but not usually. Luther didn't include them in the Old Testament because he said they are useful for reading, but they do not engender faith. And so to Luther, they didn't fit the structure of law and gospel, of grace that he was, that he wanted to impart to people. He wasn't the first one that questioned the inclusion of the books. That had happened for over 1,000 years. But his decision, along with John Calvin's decision, separately from him, led to us, if you find them now in the Bible, very often they're kind of an appendix. We tuck them in the back, or they're a little appendix that we put after the Old Testament. But these are books that were generally written between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. And I mention them because this is the place where the Jewish people become more, I don't want to say more open to or receptive of, they become more conscious of eternity. So I say, hope leans toward the weight of eternity. Hope for redemption in heaven. Hope at the resurrection of the dead. This is something that, if you're looking in the Psalms or you're looking in the earlier scriptures in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes you read something about Sheol or the pit. And that was a very early Jewish idea of what happens after death. It's kind of a shadowy nether world where, once you once you die, your spirit goes to this place. And that was the conclusion of things. When King Saul wants to find out if he's on the right track, he goes to the Witch of Endor, who is able to conjure up the spirit of Samuel from the underworld, from Sheol. And so that kind of gives you an idea of the early Israelite idea of what happens when you die. And so as Jewish thought moves forward, they come to understand that there must be something that happens later. And so you see a lot of that development in those books between the Old Testament and the New. The two books I listed here, there's a book called The Wisdom of Solomon, and then there's a book called The Wisdom of Ben Sira, or The Wisdom of Sirach. And they provide two different competing ideas of what wisdom is. Ben Sira says, wisdom is intended for this world. Wisdom is intended for the way you live your life now. It is, they are ways that you can live out your fidelity to and relationship with God. And the Wisdom of Solomon says, wisdom is primarily for what happens after you die. Wisdom is the way that you show your relationship to God in this world, yes. But the ultimate goal is not simply to show your relationship to God. The goal is by doing this, you will be recognized in the future. This is what you will experience in the future. We see a little bit of this too in the two books of Maccabees. I realize I'm giving you a lot of information. But in the two books of Maccabees, they are two tellings of the story of Judah the Maccabee and his sons. So a very short version is by the time the Greeks are ruling the area, one king decides that he wants to de-Judaize the Jews. He wants them to be like the other people in his kingdom. And so he goes to the temple in Jerusalem. He puts up other symbols of Zeus, so on and so forth, and he slaughters a pig on the altar. Now this is an outrage. And so there is an old priest by the name of Judah, who ends up being called Judah Maccabee, which means Judah the Hammer. He goes out from the countryside, he assembles an army with his sons, and they wage war on this king and the Greeks. So very early on, they discover there is a problem with their plan. The law tells them that you do no work on the Sabbath. And so the king realizes that all he has to do is wait 6 days. And then he could slaughter all the soldiers. Because they do not have to, they won't fight back. And so the question arises for the Jewish soldiers, what they're going to do. Some of the Jewish soldiers say, well, there is, knowing that there's an afterlife, it is important for us to follow this law, even if we are to die, and accept that our reward for being good, being good followers of God's law, that we will be rewarded for it in the next, in the next life. Some of them say, no, God desires for us to live, and so we must break this commandment so that we can keep all the others. And that is a this world centered, not as concerned about the afterlife, but this shows how people are grappling with this idea of what do you hope for. Some of them hoped for the afterlife, and for that reason chose to maintain strictly, to hold strictly to the law. Some of them hoped for redemption in this life. And so, not that they denied resurrection or they denied eternal life, but this shows that people are still trying to weigh out the balance of these ideas. And so that's an idea that's developing. It doesn't just develop in one way. This is being worked out among different groups. Sorry, I realized that was a lecture.
Weren't there more than 2 Maccabees in that section?
There are more. There are 2 more.
Yeah.
But 3rd Maccabees isn't a narrative of the story. And 4th Maccabees is actually an unrelated sermon on reason and faith. What, am I done?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but people are arriving.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm sorry. I talked too long. In that case, I commend that last page to you. I have a few things for you to think about as you go out from this place. Are there differences, and if so, what, between hope and anticipation, or between hope and optimism? Are there differences? I think there are some differences, but that's just me. You might think differently, so I commend that to you. And then on the back, talking about reading the scriptures, reading for hope. Spoiler alert, I will talk about reading backwards later. Pete and Margaret have already heard what I have to say about reading backwards. But hope doesn't only come by reading the scriptures in one way. Where do we find hope in the scriptures? Reading forwards, reading from the ancient stories of Abraham and Moses and the return from exile. How does that give us hope? How does the end of the biblical story, Revelation, Paul's promises of God gathering up everything, how does that bring us hope? And what does reading about hope in God, what does that mean for, when I say me, I don't mean me. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for us as a church, as a community, as a world? What do those things mean now? And I realize those are huge questions, but don't worry, there won't be a test later. I just commend them to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.